we're excited once again to have Laurie, Kelley, and Allan Blum, who have been our partners with the Transformation Project from Loeb and Troper since the beginning of our initiative back in 2015. Laurie is the Director of Special Needs Consulting at Loeb and Troper. She previously held the distinction of Commissioner at OPWDD, and before that was actually an executive of one of the state's ARC chapters. So her experience and background provide her with a unique perspective and expertise as the consultant in our transformation project from Loeb and Troper. Joining her is her colleague from L&T, Allan Blum. He is a CPA and is actually a partner at Loeb and Troper. His focus on specialty audit areas and allows him to do consulting in the special needs agency area. He offers strategic consulting and has been a president of a not-for-profit board. Obviously, this gives him both sides of the fence, allowing him to have a valuable look and unique insights into the issues at hand that we are all facing as we work to transform our programs from less integrated to more inclusive environments as we move forward. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this back over to Laurie and Allan and allow them to share their insights, their ideas, and their technical expertise around creating the narrative for employment success. Thank you, Laurie. Thank you, Allan. It's all yours.
Great. Thank you, Pat. I really appreciate it. Loeb and Troper really has enjoyed being part of a partnership on helping organizations figure out what they're doing with employment services, and with NYSRA's involvement with the BIP grant and thanks to OPWDD for providing those fundings, I think we're helping organizations try and figure out their roadmap for the future. And it's a challenge when you have been informed that one of your key program elements that have supported people for decades is all of a sudden going away and needs to become something else. It's unnerving for many, many people. So I know in the past we've talked about corporate structures, we've talked about how it impacts the financial statements, and today we really want to focus a little bit more on board because the board is a critical element that you need to engage in any significant change in an organization, and it takes a lot of an executive director's time to do that, and really there is an art to working with boards.
Yes, there is, and as was indicated before, in addition to my working life, I have a volunteer life, which seems to take up a lot of time, but it's very pleasurable. And being a president of a board is a unique position because you actually get to work with all the members. You see people's attitudes, good, bad, and different. Also, you understand how much time people are willing to put in. So I've experienced a lot of items with regard to the board that I work with, a lot of very positive things, a lot of very good people who try to further the mission of the organization. And they're very, very intuitive in terms of a lot of things that are going on with regard to our particular organization. When we are in a change mode, when we're looking to move from one type of funding to another type of funding, or as we've been talking about through the transformation panel, moving into a for-profit environment, it does take quite a bit of effort. And one overarching principle that I've discovered as part of working with boards is that you always find that there are a few core individuals who are really attentive, who are really active, who drive the mission of the organization. A lot of times they do rise up to the executive committee level. And then the struggle is, how do we get other board members involved? And as Laurie said, the executive director's time or CEO's time, a lot of it is spent managing the board. It's actually a dual role whereby the board is managing the CEO and the CEO is managing the board, and everybody has expectations. They don't always meet in the middle. So we do have to make sure that we do understand what we need. I also have, as part of the board membership that I've been on, I've experienced change. I've gone from an organization that potentially was about to go out of business to a very thriving organization that's actually the center of the community again, as it used to be, through a lot of effort, through a lot of hard work, through a lot of change process within there. So we do have to not be afraid of changes. We do have to ensure that we understand what needs to be done. And as part of that, there's a lot of analysis that should be had. And a little bit later on in the discussion here this morning into this afternoon, we do talk about qualities of board members, expertise and experience of board members, and how you would go forward in terms of engaging the type of members that you need to move the organization in the appropriate direction. So the agenda today, we'll be talking about board engagement. We'll be talking about educating your board on the changing world that we do live in. Of course, governance complements administration, and when you do have good, strong governance and the tone at the top, everything else does flow even better. And then exploring our board complement, as I said, with regard to needs, expertise, and moving forward in terms of the programs and future operations, and a little drop about dashboard reporting.
Yeah, so it is a pretty full agenda. Just a point of reference again, I was an executive director, so you know what it's like to have how many ever bosses you have based on the board of director numbers that are on yours. I was fortunate I had 24 board members on my organization that I reported to. So you really need to understand the uniqueness each one of them. Coupled with that, you know, since I've been now doing other things in my career, my husband in the local community was asked to come on the board of the ARC chapter that I was affiliated with. And it's so interesting hearing his perspective on things because, again, I've lived and breathed this field forever. He's heard the peripheral rants and raves as an executive director. And now hearing from a board's vantage point what he's bringing forward, I just find it interesting on, again, how much needs to take place in terms of managing boards, and it's just a unique opportunity to begin to look at those type of things. And again, we do open for questions wherever. Engaging your board, and you know these are pretty well known things, but it's things we often forget about. And when you finally get someone that's very active in the community wanting to be engaged in your organization and help be an ombudsman with the organization and become a board member, one of the critical factors is that point of start. And we often don't think about that because we're always looking for volunteers and really trying to get committed people. If you think about the complexities of any of our non-for-profit organizations, let alone just the unique thinking of the non-for-profit organizations, but all the governmental oversight and the controls, there is so much information that really needs to go into developing a board to understand how they can add further value to your organization. And it's critical that we really begin to look at what are you doing for board orientation, and that's the starting point in reality. So it's just something to go back and think about. You know your organization's changing, the culture's changing, but the requirements for board governance have changed as well, and we will be touching on those as we go forward in the presentation.
And that's an extremely important area. Many board members dip their feet into the waters. They've never been on boards before. They do not know their roles and responsibilities. Here in New York State, we do have quite a bit of regulations. The Charities Bureau, who does regulate not-for-profit boards, has issued quite a bit of good guidance in terms of responsibilities, in terms of good governance, in terms of conflicts of interest and the like that board members must follow and ensure that they are not doing things in the wrong manner. So the orientation should include all these types of things. I actually have a session that I talk about in the first board meeting of each year where we do go through some of the items from the Charities Bureau to make sure that the board is effectively oriented.
You know, the board has come to, members come to you with some talent, and I think, you know, you are really should be spending some time with that board member, the people in leadership, to understand what talent they bring forth and marrying that talent up to help further the agency's mission. Because it is at that point of engagement that you're going to capture them for probably the longest period of time because they're fresh and they're new. And I'm not saying long-term board members are not interested and invested, but it's really trying to find that niche that works. One of the complicating factors with that, and I'll use my husband for example, he is a financial advisor, so his employer puts limitations on the level of engagement he can have in the organization, and in fact the area that he could best support the organization, because of his employer, he is not allowed to do that. And there's so much disclosure going on looking at this, so we really need to do much homework and then figure out what's optimum and how do you marry these things, because you really don't want to get into conflict of interest anywhere possible, and you don't want to jeopardize employment relationships at the same time. So it's just something to be thinking about, because as the standards are becoming higher, the employer of board members, if the board members are still working, there's many mandates being placed on them as well. So it's multifaceted that we're beginning to look at things.
And as you're going through your board protocols and trying to engage your board, as you see on the slide, we talk about show the good, the bad, the ugly of challenges that lie ahead and accomplishments of the past. We, as a board, just actually brought on 4 new board members. And we're up to, I believe, 19 in total. So Laurie had a bigger board than I have right now. But part of that is how manageable are the individuals, how manageable is the size of the board that you do have. But we've been very open and honest, and we've told them where we were. And now the fact that we were almost out of business, that we had to regenerate almost everything within the organization, and we want to scare them away if they are not willing to put their time in, they're not willing to be part of the whole thing. And you know, as Laurie was saying, when I first came on the board, it was actually a very interesting process, because I had never served on a board. I dealt with not-for-profits for about 21, 22 years about at that point in time, was very thrilled of somebody asking me to come onto a board, that I would have that expertise and I would have the ability to help an organization. And sometimes you get the stars in your eyes a little bit, and you say, well, there's work involved, but you kind of don't realize it. So when they brought me on the board, we went through the process, and these days the process does include things like filling out conflicts of interest forms before you actually come on the board itself, and some other protocols. But they got me on the board, they voted me in, and a couple of days later they said, okay, you're a CPA, we want you to be the treasurer. So when you think about talents, you think about people's experience, that we're going to want people to work in their expertise, not a problem with regard to my workplace, with regard to what I do, and something that I can help in the organization on a moving forward basis. And when you're talking about foster open inquiry and respectful dissent and introspection, it's very interesting because every board has different personalities within them. And some personalities are very helpful, some personalities are hurtful. You do have to get that happy medium in between. But when you don't have open inquiry, when you don't have the appropriate dissent, you never actually get to the bottom of a particular situation that you might be thinking about. And I will use my board as an example throughout today's session, because I think it's very helpful when we hear experience on the ground as to what was happening. And the second board meeting, I believe, that I was at, we're listening to our CEO's report, going through a whole bunch of different things about the programs, but we don't hear one word about metrics. We don't hear one word about units that we're providing within the programs. We don't hear about dollar signs or numbers within the report, just really a lot of fluff. A number of us then asked a couple of questions about metrics, about a couple of different things. Long story, that board meeting went on for about 3 more hours after that first inquiry by a number of us board members, and that started the slippery slope of change, because we did realize again that we needed to make sure we had a lot of metrics and information for the organization to move forward. So that we took that opportunity, we engaged a number of board members, we had them really help with this process, and what we learned, as I said before, there are always a few core people that are going to be part of the whole. The question then is, how do I get the other individuals further involved? And what we did learn was when we really spark their interest in a particular area, they will work on it. And you know, as an interesting thing, a little tidbit, we as a board have been struggling recently to get more talent in our finance area. We actually did an email blast, we're a membership organization, to our entire membership, and we thought we'd get 1 or 2 responses. And at the end of the day, we got about 25 responses. We interviewed 21 individuals over a week-and-a-half period of time, and we brought on to committees, not technically the board just yet because we want to grow them, 20 individuals. And they are working in different committees, whether it be the education committee, the finance committee, governance committees, growth committees, but we are then looking further to how we can move the mission of the organization, make things real and meaningful, and ensure that we have all the experience and expertise that we need in order to move this forward, either for-profit or not-for-profit. And as we do indicate on the bottom of the slide, educate, educate, educate. It is a continuous process. We do need to make sure that that board is involved, and if they don't know what's going on in the programs, then we can't educate them. We've taken the opportunity that at almost every board meeting, we do ask a program director to come to the meeting, give a 5 to 15-minute update as to what's happening within there. And for instance, we have programs, so we do off-site board meetings. We have a large camp operation, and we do in the summer a board meeting in the camp. We actually see and feel and experience the activity that's going on, and the rah-rah-rah. So it actually brings a lot of the board members further into the organization as to their wanting to do more for us.
When I think back of my years in exec, and I think of the two bullets on here, and showing the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then fostering open inquiry and respectful dissent, you always think that's kind of contrary to what an exec would want. And, you know, I've joked with Allan often offline on, I loved the board meetings that I was challenged and debated. As painful as that is, because you want to be prepared and be able to show that you're in command of things, you really often end up with a better product if the board fully understands and is able to debate things. In addition, what ends up happening, they're wonderful ombudsmen in the community. They gain a richer understanding of what you're actually doing versus just providing supports for people with disabilities. You're just an employment center, and I don't mean that in a negative way. They can really begin to open doors that can really bring an advantage to you, that really helps foster ongoing relationships and possible, you never know, collaboration, opportunities, business ventures that you might not have even thought of in the past.
Fundraising efforts. We actually had a board member very instrumental in bringing an honoree to one of our events, and it just so happened that this year's event was the most fruitful event that we've ever had, and we just started our 60th anniversary back in July. So that tells you a lot about what a board member can do for you as an organization.
You know, again, we brought up the fact that you need to educate, and it feels like every board meeting, again, having been exec, you're bringing up bad news, government influence, all of those components. It is absolutely critical that the board begin to understand what is really causing those sphere of influences, because they can get angry and hostile about certain things that are happening to the organization that are outside your control, but at the same time, the exec needs to help really encourage the board to embrace the change and figure out the solutions going forward. So that's where the partnership really comes into play. You know, when I look at the education topics, you really need to understand who or what is influencing our changing world. I was just having a conversation a little while ago, probably half an hour ago, about the changes to the work centers. And, you know, I was sharing with this person that I was engaged with that, you know, the work centers were really fostered out of the Wagner Act back in 1934, when you really came down to minimum wage and those components. The regulations haven't changed. The world has changed drastically since 1934, and what we're at is the predecessor of those changes all coming to play at the same time. So you've really got to go back to what's influencing the change, and there's some things that, yes, you have a right to be angry, but there's some things you're not going to influence. So you need to know where your battles are going to be and where you can help them put their energy so that you end up optimally going through a change effectively. Understanding why changes are coming. You know, it's really critical that, yes, you look at, for example, the minimum wage component and what's going to be happening and the ripple effect on that and the cost implications for the organization. It's any theme that you bring forward. It's trying to help feed all of those elements through so that your board has an adequate comprehension to be able to provide governance and oversight to you to effectively, strategically position you for the future. I bring up understanding the sphere of influence on the changes. Your board member most likely will not be able to stop the movement of work centers moving to integrated business venues. They might be able to help facilitate the process to get there, but the fact that that ship's left the port, it's really important to understand that you're probably not going to be able to change some governmental things. So again, it's putting the focus where it needs to be. And you as an exec need to help them become educated. You help them identify what the problem is, but help them, in fact, begin to understand where they can help support and drive changes so you're strategically positioned for the future.
So as we look at the current era, we see a lot of slimness in terms of good news. We have a lot more compliance. We have a lot of increased oversight, a lot of unfunded mandates in terms of the organization. Very hard for a board member to get their hands around this type of an item unless they're living in our world. That's one thing I struggle with a lot with my board members, because they don't understand what compliance means. They don't understand what the increased scrutiny and oversight is. Even if they are in their own businesses, a lot of times, unless they're working in the SEC world, they really don't have that scrutiny that might be happening. And when you try to explain it to them, they kind of look at you with crossed eyes, because as we don't understand, why do we need all this compliance? Why do we need to make sure that we triple check these things 3 or 4 different times? So education in this area is going to be very, very important, so that the not-for-profit people or the non-parents do understand what might be going on and what their responsibilities are with regard to it. And in terms of lack of trends, very, very hard to run an organization. How do we go about not giving raises to our staff for a 2, 3, 4, more than that in terms of period of time? And there are a lot of causes with regard to, maybe do we need to cut back on expenses? Do we need to have other sources of revenues? And when we're looking at these things, it does impact your overall budgeting and trends and how you're looking at the operations of the organization.
You might also need to, lack of trends, it goes back to the economics, is the program ending up being a financial drain to the whole. And that's a hard discussion to get into in the board, but it's something that's going to be critical going forward. I happen to have run an Article 28 clinic, and again, my background has been healthcare in the past, and they're very hard to break even, and we were losing a significant amount of money. And when I really looked at what that program was doing, high quality, providers loved it, patients loved it. When you look at all of those matrices, we were blowing it out of the water. Yet I was eating into $1 million of my bottom line every year. So you get to a point in time, are the dollars that we're spending really benefiting the community by and large, and there's no way to make up and recoup that money and go back to the board and really convince them that the best thing to do is transition this to another provider that makes you economically solid. The quality might not be quite as high, gold star, but again, it's gold star, but it might not be gold triple star. At the same time, it could fill the bill. And it's those kind of discussions that you really need an active dialogue with the board, because they're tough. They're really tough discussions to get into, because there's a lot of emotions tied to what we've done in the past.
And rate rationalization is similar. When we looked at it originally, 50% of the agencies theoretically wouldn't get a benefit, 50% of the agencies were going to get hurt. As we move a little bit further in the rate rationalization progress, we are moving more towards weighted averages as opposed to your particular cost. So how do you budget that on a going forward basis? How do board members understand what this whole rate rationalization does mean to them? And that all directly correlates with potential minimum wage impact. We hear a lot about this with regard to the government and ensuring that we do have higher minimum wages going forward, but how do you pay for it? How do we expand our programs with regard to those particular areas, which then also potentially lead to recruitment difficulties, which I know many providers have been having already. So when you think about it, yes, minimum wage increases might help us with recruitment, but if there is a minimum wage increase across the board, and somebody can get $15 an hour working for McDonald's, why would they work for $50 an hour at a DD organization with the Justice Department, Justice Center, breathing down their neck? So a lot of different things that we do have to worry about in terms of this and engagement of our board members and the constituents going forward.
I think, if you've had long-term board members, one of the critical elements here is really helping them to understand the world we lived in for the last 15 years is gone, and that the world we're going into is quite not as predictable and ever-changing. So while it may appear schizophrenic to the management team, at the same time the board needs to understand that you're in control of the situation to where you can be in control, but you're clearly telling them what's beyond your control and helping them to position and strategize on what you do for the future.
And again, engage them with their expertise in order to solve the issues that you have on a regular basis.
You know, we need to be painting the picture for tomorrow, and, you know, again, I think this sign kind of just gives you some of the components. Expectations of government have changed. I mean, it's very clear what was present before is not present now. However, the agency mission has not. I often go back into many of my discussions on focusing the board on the mission. Because if you really go back to clearly what the mission is and then look at the changes, it will help drive those decisions that need to be made. You really need to make sure everything is aligned to that mission purpose and move in that venue, because it's very easy to get caught up with all these changes and move off mission base. And the more you do that, you will begin to see an organization diluted over time.
Hey, Laurie, this is Pat. Pat, this is Pat at the page. I have a question, though, about that. You know, many of our agencies, I would suspect, have had members of their board for a while, and they're committed to everything that goes on. Do either of you and Allan, have any suggestions in regards to helping them see that their commitment and their dedication as a board member, because of the things that are expected from government, could be, maybe they'll do something different? Got some ideas around that? I mean, we're going really great with all this conversation about the do's and the don'ts, but I think some of it, if you've got any insight to ways to encourage people to thank them very much for their years of service, but now maybe they might consider doing something else with the agency instead of being on the board. Any thoughts on that?
There are some things you can do, and it's going back to your bylaws. You know, again, I hate to go back to a lot of the corporate structure, but it's looking at board classifications, and is there an emeritus branch of the board overall? And it's a way that, in fact, with emeritus, they really often don't have voting rights and some of those other components. So it's beginning to move them into those kind of functions, or having them in the committee function component, and really move them out of some of the key decisions. The other thing to begin to work with is the board is with bylaws. Do you explore term limits and what that might mean? Because one way of not having forever member boards is really going into a term limit situation, and there should be an opportunity to continually bring fresh blood in, and that should be explored as part of the recruitment strategy as well.
And the term limits are really key to this, and there is a movement in the government to push for term limits, and it's actually a double-edged sword, because you do want new blood, you do want new people there, but you want a little bit of the historic value of those older board members. It's interesting because in my organization we do have sort of have term limits. We're revising our bylaws. We're thinking about putting them in formally. So one of my very active board members is coming up on her 10th year on the board, and we've kind of indicated that, you know, at this point in time, maybe you need to take a year off, and then you can come back in a different, different situation on the board or helping through a committee. It took about a year for the individual to get comfortable with that because they were so involved. They did so much for the organization. She actually was the president of the board right before me. So when you think about it, it's very hard to disengage. But one very important quality the individual had was she was an agent for change. So we had a term limit for the board presidents of 3 years. It's actually a 1 year re-elected 3 times. We had asked her to stay on for another 2 years, and I remember at the time all the board members were very happy to re-elect the individual for another couple of years. She insisted, no, we need to have change. We need to have new visions of what might be going on. They then tapped me on the shoulder and they said, well, would you like to be the board president? And I had a lot of hesitations on it. I took it in the end, and now I'm through my 3 years of being the board president. I've actually in my 4th year, because they have asked me to spend another year within my term. solely due to the reason that we did not have a future successor in the pipeline when I was going through my second to third year. So this new blood, these new individuals as part of the organization, when you have a new president, it's a different focus, it's a different look at how things are being operated, and it is extremely important to get them there. And on the flip side, as Laurie was saying, we are establishing what's called a board of advisors. So we'd be more of a philanthropic type of a position. We still want to keep them abreast of everything that's going on in the organization so they know where these opportunities might be. We don't want to lose their talent and experience, but there does come a time when people get a little bit tired, when there is a time that we need to move into the new people, and we change the ages of our board. And actually, we got rid of a lot of dead wood over the period of time, because you do have members who seem to sit there a lot and really never do anything. So there is always a potential future for those members who have been there for a long time.
Great question, Pat. You know, again, it's a challenge. It gets into, again, management doesn't have a right to change board members. Board members do have a right to change management. So it's working back through the key leadership positions, getting them on board to help figure out how do you strengthen the overall body. Because, again, your key committed board members realize that's important.
Yes.
Again, staffing, margins are decreasing. I always go back to let's look at what services are critical. It's absolutely essential the board does that. We know that staffing is critical for excellence in service for the future, and as the unemployment has really decreased, we realize the staffing pools are out there. You really need board and management to help champion greatness in staffing and celebrate those things that can be celebrated. I know we often, because we have so many things on our plate, are always looking at those. I feel like I'm a penny with the sky is falling, but it's always taking time to go back and say, oh, this is great, let's see what we can celebrate. The other critical element which boards often, and Allan touched upon it briefly, are basically outcome measures or components the board needs to be looking on, and we will touch upon some ways to be potentially looking at that through dashboard reporting. Some non-for-profits have gone in that venue, many have not, but it's a way to really pictorially get things done quickly so the board can get a quick glimpse of where things are standing and where attention may need to be given.
And the next number of slides are here for informational purposes of things that, educating the board, making sure that everybody understands what the organization is dealing with on a regular basis. So that is going to be a key component. We know inherently about Medicaid. They do provide the 55 cents of every dollar being spent in New York State. We know that there's been a reduction in dollars being available to the providers. We're talking about the workshop changing. That's been the focus of the transformation model that we've been working on for the past year or so. And when we're thinking about this, we do have to understand that less government dollars, what does that mean to the board? One thing we talk about on our board with regard to engagement is fundraising, and that's a very sore topic actually, because a lot of times when you go to the board, there are certain commitments you ask them to make, and you keep going back to the well, keep asking them for additional contributions within the organization. So how do you get them more involved with regard to engage the organization so they bring other people to the facility, to the board, to the organization to make sure that they can help move that forward also. Things like the waiver amendment that describes the agreement with CMS, the federal agenda in terms of moving persons towards center delivery of care. A lot of intricacies for a board member to get their hands around, but we do have to have that explanation. We do have to get them up to speed. And once they do learn more about how the organization does operate and the rules and regulations that we have to worry about, they actually have a lot of really good ideas. I'll give you the example of corporate compliance program. The organization where I am the president of the board has no formal requirement with regard to a corporate compliance program. We do not receive Medicaid dollars. We have a lot of different funding. However, when we think about it, we have a lot of oversight agencies who can come in, who can stop the programs, who can change the way we're doing things. And it was very important for us to move forward with educating the board. And then board members stepped forward and they said, we can help. We know about these things. We can help you implement these types of items within your organization.
The slides that we've put in here regarding like the Center for Medicaid and some of these other elements are really done for the sake of it's something that you could use within your own board, because a lot of times I know as an exec you don't have an opportunity to pull all this information together and really help highlight these things, because getting a board to understand how much influence the federal government has on the states working, and that then in turn affects what is happening to you as a provider is really critical, and that's really the relevance of what we're trying to show. Again, the world is transitioning. This is all news to all of you in the field, but it may not be fully understood in the board. FFS, I should probably get rid of that acronym now that I'm looking at it. I'm used to thinking in these terms, but it's fee for service, and basically we will be moving into managed care, and just getting paid on a claim is not what's going to be happening in the future. So it's really looking at those venues that are critical. We will be aligning more with healthcare thinking in the future, and it's really important that you begin to look at your board complement as well to see, do you have people that understand some of these elements? Because we're so used to the way things have been that we're often not stopping to think where things are headed, and there's so many pressures going forward. With the DD world, we know we're moving into the person-centered delivery of services, but that is true in every other health field as well. It's happening in nursing homes, it's happening in mental health, it's happening in OASIS. Everything is focused on the person and how do we move that forward. And we will be moving eventually towards value for payment. As much as we are struggling in the DD world of getting into that, that's what is going to be expected, because that is the agenda that's being driven, is you will have value for payment and things will be tied to those components. A little bit about DSRIP. I know we often don't think about DSRIP because in the DD world it hasn't hit us much, but at the same time there will be a hit going forward. We are part of DSRIP whether we want to acknowledge it or not. That is really the Delivery System Reform Incentive Payment, and that is based on what happened with the Medicaid redesign team several years ago. And what the DSRIP really resulted in is an agreement with the federal government to keep some of the federal dollars if they put some incentives in place to change the health care system in the state. And we're dealing billions of dollars being kept in the state. Now, they'll be part of hitting those targets that are expected. And we're looking at improving population health, reducing costs. Reducing costs is critical, and we will be moving into care management, as is what's coming forward with conflict-free case management in the future. Was there a question?
No, we just briefly lost audio for a moment.
Okay. Do you have it now?
Yep, you're all set. Go ahead.
Okay. Do you need me to go back at all, Nicole, or are we okay?
Pat, that's your recommendation. Maybe just go back in the past, like, 30 seconds. It went out for literally, like...
On the DSRIP, again, as I said, basically, if you heard this, I'm sorry I'm repeating, but again, we're looking at the Delivery System Reform Incentive Payment Goals, and this is really tied to the agreement that the state made with CMS having to do with Medicaid dollars, and the state could keep some $7 billion if they in fact hit some of these targets, and they involve reducing cost and managing population health overall for the Medicaid population. So again, you begin to see we are part of DSRIP if you look at any of the DSRIP documents. However, because we're not in managed care, this has not yet hit us at this point in time. But some of the key elements, if you look at any of the themes that are in the DSRIP, as well as in what's coming out in OPWDD's transformation information, reduced costs is within that, as well as care management for all, which really leads us into the conflict-free case management. Again, we will be moving towards value-based payment, just so people continually think about this. DSRIP, you have full spell out of that previously, 80 to 90% of all payments must be value-based going forward by the year 2019. And that's not too far away if you think about it. We're almost at 2017, and we in DD haven't even moved into managed care. Again, the state is committed with the federal, and there are significant dollars tied up in this. And if we don't hit those targets, I'm not sure what the outcomes will be with that. So it's just an element to be aware of. And again, these slides are really put in for you to help educate your board on some of the components we will be facing.
And if you want to get an understanding a little bit about these districts more, the OMH world has really moved there full force. Many OMH providers are members of districts. It's actually a whole interesting phenomenon that they're going through. A lot of different organizations being set up, whether it be individual practice associations or IPAs and things like that. But everybody seems to be coming up with different agreements, different workarounds in terms of how they're going to work within the district. And at least, thank goodness, within the district plan, there has been some free flow of money to help organizations get themselves into gear and ensure that they can educate themselves with regard to what this does mean.
I just think it's always helped to begin to think about the evolution of the DD world, and you think back of where we were. We had institutions, and that doesn't seem like it was that long ago. I know there's still some institutions around when you look at the developmental centers. The field moved into provider-based, you know, and that's how the community outgrowth had really happened. The next evolution truly is to person-directed services, and while we've had that lately, you will see more and more put in the hands of the person, and really a lot of that decisions and factors being done in that venue. That is a huge change when you look at an operation of an organization and how the board might think about service delivery. I know we had debates on numerous board members, parent board members, when I was an exec, on what they felt their children were capable of. And I know they were very comfortable with provider-based services and became very nervous with person-directed services, but often we pushed many of the decisions to person-directed services because that was what the best outcome was for the person.
Actually, this slide is a great slide because it talks about a lot of things we've been dealing with. I'll talk about the past, I'll talk about the present, I'll let Laurie talk a little bit more about the future. But in the past, we had many businesses expected as part of the community participation. The board members, you know, a lot of them on the not-for-profits, and we'll talk a little bit about later where, you know what, you had board members who would sit on multiple boards. They really don't have much of a role in any particular one of them. Management ran the show. You had a lot of founders within organizations who controlled the boards. I know that that's a bad word these days, and it should be, because at the end of the day, we do need to make sure we have the right oversight. So the past is the past, and when you have people who are still holding on to it, that's when organizations potentially do get into trouble, and that's where the board comes in. And we need the board to push that future and to make sure that we do have the era of change. So,
with the past, I also think back of at the time it was so easy to get board members because many businesses that you had in the community required community engagement. And I think that's, again, often why you didn't see, you might have a member that was part of a board but weren't actively engaged in the board component. So you had many more volunteers just because, you know, we used to have IBM in our community, and that was an expectation of management with IBM that you become involved with a community organization and donate time. I know much of the banking industry had that requirement as part of employment and management. And you just look over time, the time is not often given within an employment structure anymore to allow that freedom for board engagement.
And where are we now? What's the present? We are mission driven. We know that. We're really trying to provide as many services to our consumers. We want to get the board involved with it. We want to help them push it. We're in the era of good governance. And the question then comes down, what is good governance? What is that definition? Do we do everything perfectly? Do we strive for continuous improvement? And those two words, I think, are very, very important in everything that we do, that we are continuously improving things. Nobody's ever perfect. There's always going to be something that we do have to worry about. And as part of that, what is the role of the board? What should that board do? Where do they precipitate the future? And really, what does the board do? They set policy, they oversight, they oversee, they monitor. They want to make sure that the CEO and executive management is performing their functions and moving the organization appropriately into the future. In terms of the role of management, they have to then take those policies that the board have set, implement them on a day-to-day basis, make sure that we are squeaky clean, making sure that we are ensuring that the board does know what's going on that regular basis, because they do have the fiduciary responsibility. We all know there is significant increased governmental oversight, whether that be reviews of cost reports, whether that be EO38 filings, whether that be the Office of Medicaid Inspector General, who's been running around for quite a number of years now and auditing organizations and looking at every little intricacy as to how things are done. And it's actually very interesting when these, when things like places like the OMIG comes in or other governmental auditors. Yeah, it's not fun, but you do understand and learn where your weaknesses are. Really, the question would be, in the current and going into the future, how do we perform our own reviews? How do we determine where we are weak before the regulators do come in? Because our goal, of course, at the end of the day is full transparency, make sure that we know and provide all the information to all our constituents, because at the end of the day, the board and management need to be in a partnership. You hear a lot of times with regard to CEOs, the board is micromanaging me. They're not letting me do anything. They want to make sure that they're in every last decision. They're involved in every last road that we do take. There has to be a happy medium at the end of the day. And yes, the CEO and the executive management team needs the leeway to operate, but the board, as we know, has that fiduciary responsibility. So my answer to that whole partnership is very simple. It's called communication. And when the CEO and the board does communicate on a regular basis, everybody knows where everybody else is at, and it's usually the right direction on a going forward basis.
In the future, probably two of the most critical elements truly are stay true to your mission. You know, really go back to that continually, because once you deviate, that's where you begin to really have issues. And the other one is transparency. The more that you are comfortable sharing with the board what is happening, why it's happening, the good, bad, the ugly, the more you can gain their support in getting answers and solutions. If you gloss over things and make the world look like the glass is half full when it's really half empty, I have found often it will damage in the future because you lose that credibility with the board. I was very fortunate in many ways, and yet at the same time I was unfortunate that my board really trusted me 200%. And basically, if I brought recommendations forward, it was not challenged often. And I really appreciated the times it was challenged, because I can't be the go-all, be-all to everything. And I often felt the more that they were engaged, the better the organization's help was. It may have made my job somewhat more difficult as an exec, but at the same time, I was more concerned about the health of the organization, which can't be single-person dependent.
So as part of that, Laurie, just as a question, I'm a very controlling individual as part of my board presidency, and yes, my CEO does talk to me about micromanagement. So the question is, with regard to a good relationship in terms of the CEO and the board president, the board chair, whoever that direct relationship is, because yes, they'll be interacting with all the board members, but the primary relationship is that top individual. What is the best relationship in terms of give and take?
You want to be able to share candidly with the board president, but I've often found too, I was fortunate I had an executive committee, and a lot of times if you get an executive committee fully invested in a discussion, not that the board, you prep the board president first, but you have more voices planted at the board meeting to help carry a mission forward or discussion forward. I was facing a point in time when I really felt that we needed to do a major revamping of our management and restructuring of the organization. And that's a challenging discussion because many board members have relationships over years, yet at the same time when you want to look at where you need to get, how you might maneuver dollars, you need to be able to share data and elements to show the board what you're seeing with corrective measures of what you're planning on doing to get their buy-in and debate the issues and timing and all of those elements. Those discussions were very, very in-depth, very, very candid, and out of that grew a mutual respect of one another, really understanding all of those elements that are taking place. And I often found fully educating 4, 5, 6 board members, not that you wouldn't do further education with the full board, but you had at least a core group understanding some of the most difficult issues coming forward, that in fact when you brought it to the full group, you could help manage the discussion at the overall board level.
Thank you, and that's what I see also. The CEO and I have a lot of conversations. All the original tough items we try to deal with directly ourselves, and then once I'm on board and I fully understand what they are dealing with, we will bring it to the bigger group. I actually have a very good core executive committee who's very, very involved, who look at a lot of different angles of issues, and we come up with a great strategy as we need to on a moving forward basis. So that does help us get to the full board, and once we get into that board meeting, we are pretty much uniform. We all do agree as to where we want to go, because yes, while we might have different ideas on the original conversation, by the end of that conversation, we certainly are all on the same page.
You know, when I think about the workshop moving to an integrated employment center, many board members are vested to what's going on in the past. They might have a business relationship because they've had work done through that venue. They might have a child that's been supported in that arena for a number of years, and they find the value of the $5 paycheck and the social aspects of that employment venture. And they also know their child was taken care of during the day, and that transportation was provided for that child for the to-from situation as well. So there's many safety factors that are involved in that. Having a really active dialogue going through many of those key pressure points that are going to come to all board members at some point in time helps you to really create those talking points and understanding of what they're seeing on the contrary side, so that in fact they can begin to go forward with the mission, the discussion point. I also am on a board at a local hospital foundation, and not on the hospital board. I had been employed at one point in time at the hospital that had merged most recently, and it's just very interesting, the education that goes on, because again, they're really looking at us being the eyes and ears of the community, bringing information back, because the board members often are, and they need to be able to share, again, what they're hearing out there so that you can in fact develop strategies, because we are very much a fiber of the community and need to continue in that venue.
So a little rehash. In the past, all businesses, we had a lot of rules reporting, AICPA, SEC, whether it also be the different funding sources, very little monitoring, very few enforcement actions, and very relaxed environment in terms of the overall compliance. And once we've learned, when, yes, OMI comes walking in, and maybe they'll reinterpret some of the rules and laws, but on an inherent basis, a lot of the basic protocols might not have been in place.
When I think back, I'm just tongue-in-cheek, I'm thinking back of when I was at a hospital exec, and we used to have a bar with a bartender at the board meeting that served alcohol to the board members at a Catholic hospital, no less. And so, you know, I think back of those times, and, you know, today that would never even be considered. You know, you'd have a catered meal, it was just all the way business was. It was very relaxed, to say the least, and yes, discussion did take place. But, you know, if I said that today to someone, oh, where's the bar, you look at me like I had two heads.
Actually, we'd probably say to you, that's not allowable. We're not having those there. It's a whole different world. So in the business today, with traditional funding streams, as we know, are being eliminated, we need to determine what our particular core business is. We have board members helping us with that. They have a lot of business expertise. So what can they do to grow the organization? Like I said, I now have what's called a growth committee, where I have a number of board members who are looking at metrics. They're looking at what the needs are with regard to our community. I'm very blessed with regard that one of them is an actuary who can understand a lot of these trends and focus on how things might be shifting or moving within our community. Operational principles, of course, do shift towards the business model. We worked as a not-for-profit for so many years, whether you were established back in 1902 or in 2002. We do know that there is a change in terms of how things need to be done. It's no longer an environment where the money is flowing free. We actually have to work very, very hard. You've done it in the past, I know, but work very hard in the future to obtain new dollars, use them more economically and efficiently, and make sure that each business segment must stand on its own in terms of profitability.
Thinking about business today, you know, we're in every conversation that Allan and I have had through the webinars, it's really beginning to have nonprofits think and act like a non-for-profit acting like a for-profit. Look around your board complement. How many of them are management or leadership in a for-profit business? You know, it's really critical that you begin to look at those components because they can help you with some of the work-centered thinking, but they can also help shape up and throw out some questions that may be a little bit different thinking than what you're accustomed to, because the more you can have that different vantage point, the stronger the organization will be.
And to that point, you know, for instance, I have a board member who ran a phenomenal business, sold it at the high of the market. Individual, graduated Harvard Business School, has a very different perspective on how an organization should be run, always focusing upon this year, last year, changes and fluctuations, what does it mean to us as an organization, but that expertise really helps us a lot as we do go forward. And as I said before, in terms of the past, board members, we sat on many, many boards. I used to use the term that we used to collect board memberships like feathers in our cap, whereby, yes, we sat on many boards, we gave a few dollars to each of them, really not too interested. The few interested members that attend the board meetings, I'm finding that, you know what, it's still similar, but they all are interested, but they might not want to get involved. But really what I find is that they don't know how to get further involved. So committees and structures are going to be very important as the training grounds for your future leaders in the organization to help you as the execs moving forward in terms of your operations.
Again, transparency, critical. Accountability, you know, and good governance is really the era of the future. And some board members are not up to that task. And again, I think it goes back to Pat's question. But that is also then having board leadership that's willing to have dialogues in addition with the exec to the board members that you need to be thinking about. So when you go ahead.
So as we move forward, we know how we got here. A lot of issues with regard to the not-for-profit operations. We have Sarbanes-Oxley, a whole big scandal back in 2001 with Enron and WorldCom. A lot of more scrutiny with regard to board oversight in terms of the 990 and how the policies and protocols are actually being used and done within the organization. So each of these items did lead us to where we are right now. And of course, you know, the common theme is that there is not enough money for all the services that we do provide. So good governance, what is it? Transparency in reporting, fiscal, programmatic. We do need to understand each of the areas of the organization. I believe that the board is a big driver of this, because if the board really mandates that management provide regular ongoing information in particular detail to the finance committees, to the other committees of the organization, that will help us all move forward in terms of good governance and engaging those board members, because they then have something to bite on. And if we are providing them that information, they're going to be asking those questions, they're going to be getting more involved. As I said before, we did this e-blast. We have all these new members as our committees. We actually had our first finance committee meeting the other night. We have, I think, 4 board members who are on that committee. I now have 10 more non-board members who potentially will go into some type of board committee going into the future. But we had such a good meeting. Everybody was fully engaged. We asked for volunteers to deal with particular areas within the organization, and we're really looking forward to our next board meeting, or really finance committee meeting, where a number of the teams and groups will be coming back, giving us more information, providing more details as to how we can potentially move certain things forward. Give you examples. I had one member raise his hand, I'm going to provide an audit committee charter for you. We're dealing with other things in terms of whether or not we should increase or decrease one of our programs. Another board member jumped in on that. We want a little bit of help with regard to our back office and our finance team. Another two individuals actually said, we're going to help you with that also. So when you get them engaged, you get them involved, they really will be very helpful to you as the organization, and it's striking that right balance of not using them too much, not imposing on them, but getting them interested in something that they really appreciate. And one actually interesting caveat that we found when we were going through the interviews for all these members was a number of them said, you know what, I have a finance background. I don't want to do anything with your organization in terms of finance. I would like to work in program. So we stopped the individual, we talked a little bit further, and we said, great, we're going to use you in program, but we would like to use your financial expertise as you're reviewing the programs and understanding how everything does intertwine in terms of that program and in the overall organization. So that is engaging them, using them the right way, and making sure that while they might not want to use their overall experience for the past 30, 40, 50 years, there's always something inherently in their thought process which will help you move that all forward.
You know, I think about the ethical tone set by the board, and I think back to a discussion that we had at one of the board meetings, and it was a proposal we had put forward to go into low-cost housing with a partner, local developer in the community, and the board voted no, emphatically no, on moving forward, even though we were going to be getting a significant chunk of money to use our nonprofit component for their application. The developer really did not have a strong reputation within the community, and they were very concerned about the tainting of the situation, and it just begins to show you how the ethical tone can be set. From a pure financial business positioning standpoint, what was being proposed was 100% correct. Yet at the same time, ethics in terms of what they felt was most important in agency's reputation wrote out, and was emphatically, that's how the decision was made. And I support those type of decisions because, again, we had a very strong discussion on those elements, and it just changed a course that, again, may have been different.
So further engaging board members means strong board oversight. So the board members must be knowledgeable in their functions on the board. Whatever committee that you're involved in, whatever role that you take, whether it be an officer as opposed to just a director in the organization, they must know a lot of items with regard to what they're responsible for. Very importantly, in the second bullet, the board members must have the requisite amount of time to carry out their board responsibilities. You know, it's really good for people to say, I'd like to do, I'd like to do, I'd like to do, but in the end, if they actually don't carry it out, it never helps. I actually had that situation a number of years ago where somebody stepped up to the plate, they volunteered, I'm going to do all these spreadsheets, I'm going to work on all these different things for you, and every month came around, another meeting came around, and nothing was prepared, nothing was produced, and at the end, you know, a number of months into the year, the individual realized they didn't have the time, they then decided they're going to help us other ways in the organization, but the board commitment wasn't particularly for them. Things like reviewing and approving and establishing corporate policies is in their role, establishing and approving the organization's strategic and operating plans through the budget and other discussions, extremely important, and of course monitoring performance.
You know, when I look at the role of board, you know, one of the things that we might not be used to thinking about, I know we know they're involved in setting the new strategy, but the responsiveness to rapid change is absolutely critical. Think about from the beginning of the year to the end of the year how many changes an organization is facing, and the board has to be ready and be engaged and understand the process that's going on. I used to have some Florida snowbirds that board members that would be gone during the winter months, and by the time they came back 4 months later, it was very difficult for them to get on board because the world had changed significantly in that time. So it's, again, looking at the need for responsiveness to change. So again, a lot of this we've covered, but again, it's really looking at those core elements you want the board engaged with. The other critical elements, which we often don't think about, some of these points are out there just for you to reflect, it's the board keeping issues confidential. I happen to have run a union organization, and yet you might be bringing proposed labor issues forward, and you did not want that leaked out to the other side for negotiation purposes. I mean, that's just a very clear example, but there's many issues that you're dealing with that are so sensitive, and most board members are very good about keeping things confidential, but it's just something you need to be cognizant of and be willing to address. So again, I think a lot of these are things we've talked about. It's just a good summary point that, again, if you want to do a board orientation or begin to work on really helping the board understand what their responsibilities are versus the exec's responsibilities, these are some tools that you could use. And here's a quick summary chart just so that you have on one little page clearly what are the responsibilities of the board of directors and the executive director, CEO, and what is shared. And I know Allan's brought up numerous times micromanagement. You know, board is not responsible for day-to-day operations. They're just not. They're responsible for governance and oversight, yet those do cross at some point in time. So it's really, you know, the best relationship an exec can have with the board is not having the board micromanage, but challenge the direction, policy, and process that you might be getting to. And it's really that ongoing dialogue that's absolutely critical. So two other critical elements that we really want to talk about today truly have to do with the board complement, but then as well dashboarding. And it may be something you're familiar with and already using, which is absolutely fantastic, but it is time to really begin to assess who is on your board. You know, what are the ages? What geography do they live in if you cover a whole geography? What affiliations do they have with local government entities or the like? What business are they in or not in? Are they in for-profit business, not-for-profit business? I put in top one, healthcare management, and I put that in there because of where we're headed in the future. You also are going to have ongoing education and training. Do you have someone with that expertise? Do you have someone with the expertise on labor relations, human resources? You really need, if you are going to be going into integrated business, someone with for-profit business experience. And I strongly recommend that you have a business council in addition that could or could not be a board committee. It may just be a voluntary advisory committee of that sort. You do want people engaged in the community, but you also then want professionals such as attorneys, CPAs, and financial advisors as well. So looking at what your board, what your agency programs are, what your strengths are, what your board complement is, you begin to determine, do you have holes? And this is just an example of a way to begin to look at a potential grid that could be created for your board members. You've identified those criteria that you're after. You've identified who in fact may have that. You look at the term limits as well to begin to see when are you going to start having holes in that area. In this sample chart that's been put together, you see that the clinical healthcare management, there's none. There's none in the human resource and training. If I were going to begin to recruit new board members or have the board recruit new board members, I'd begin to focus on those areas where there's holes or where terms are actually coming to place that you're going to need a replacement, you know.
And this is where committees come into play. Organizations have quite a number of standing required committees per their bylaws, plus they might have other committees that are just operational and really help with the programmatic aspects of the organization. What you find a lot of times is that there might be members of the community who are sitting on those committees, not necessarily on the board, who are very involved, who really have a lot of expertise, and that's where you can tap into and identify your future board members, your future board leadership, because they do need to get their feet wet. And I find that it's actually not so great when you bring an individual totally unconnected to an organization directly onto the board. How do you get them involved a little bit more? As Laurie did indicate, a lot of these are expertise areas. Do we have too many of one? Do we have not enough of another? On the board that I sit on, at one point we had 5 CPAs, I believe we had 6 attorneys, not much of anything else. So that really didn't help. And at this point, the contingent has changed. We have program people, we have business people, I got CPAs, I got attorneys, I got the whole gamut of a lot of expertise with regard to what we need. However, we also have overseers as a organization by certain funders, and they've come back to us and they said, well, you know what, did you think about whether or not you need an expertise in this particular area, whether it be maintenance or oversight of your facilities, whether it be other areas in terms of transportation operations in the organization and the like. So it actually opened my eyes with regard to additional areas that you might need to understand. Certainly everything more moving with regard to human resources, the Obamacare Act and how that is transforming how we think and the different stages in terms of that moving forward and additional costs. These are items that the board members really can help and get very engaged in order to move their role forward and to potentially get more involved into your organization.
Another area that is not here, but it is an area that should be considered as cultural diversity. Anytime you're now filling out any form for the government, it is an area that's focused on, and you need to make sure that, you know, who you're providing supports and services to have a good representation of cultural diversity, because it just brings another element that can be considered in the discussions, because there are things you might not be thinking about that they can shed a light that we haven't always thought about. So there's a lot of different opportunities to really expand your complement of the board, and I think the more diversity you have, it all, and I don't mean just cultural, but diversity in backgrounds and what talents they can bring forward, it just makes the organization that much stronger.
One thing we didn't talk about today is what is the right size board? Because a lot of times you hear about boards, you know, heard this morning, mine is about 19, Laurie's board when she was the exec was about 24. I've heard boards of 45 people. I've heard boards of 90 people. You know, when you're thinking about this, I actually just went through a process of revising bylaws. It gets to be problematic when you're looking for quorums, when you're looking to vote on a legal basis for particular areas. So there are differences between supermajorities, regular majorities, and I do think getting attorneys involved as part of that process is very important, but the overarching concept is manageability. Can you manage that large of a board? If you did have 45 people show up, what type of board meeting might you have? Listen, I deal with a lot of different type of not-for-profit organizations. I've gone to board meetings where I had 100 people in the room and had to present to them. And a lot of different thought processes that come through, a lot of different expertise, and you get different questions from that, but really is that beneficial for you at the end of the day? And talking about the CEO operating on the ground and how do you manage that board, is it really too unwieldy? Are you spending all of your time just managing the board expectations as opposed to focusing in upon your regular day-to-day activities, because they're going to judge you on that at the end of the day also. So we do need to understand what is that right contingent, what is the right number, and do we have all of the right expertise or the majority of it, and identify what we still should bring on board.
Another tool to be thinking about is dashboard reporting, and this is a tool that to me can be very powerful, and the 3 slides that I do have regarding dashboard reporting all could be done on one sheet in reality if you do this. The thought behind the dashboard reporting is really picking various concepts such as finance, human resources, program, and identifying the goals, objectives that you're actually going to be looking at. So if you look at this one, for example, finance to me is always the easiest one because you're dealing with numbers and you have something that's concrete and measurable, so it's a very quick one to be able to start off with. But you do have, for example, the days of unrestricted cash on hand, and your target might be 45 days. You then have what it was six months ago, 65 days. As you can see that if you compared 6 months to the target, it's green because you had well exceeded the cash on hand days. However, if you look now, it's 18 days and it's red. The benefit of this type of reporting is it quickly shows you where you need to be paying attention without even having to read a lot on the page, because you can quickly look at the color saying, oh, let me see what this topic is, and if it's red, you know it needs significant attention. If it's yellow, you know you're going in one of 2 directions. You're either in the positive trend or you're in the negative trend. If it had been red and moved to yellow, it's probably good, but at the same time, if it was green and moving to yellow, it's probably not. So it's a way to quickly help the board, after you've identified one of those core target elements, to pictorially understand what's relevant. And you can easily create these measures, and to me, finance ones are some of the easiest to create. Some of the other ones are a little bit more challenging, but the more you can align that with the organizational goals and directions for the coming year, it helps you create a way for the board to stay on top of key issues that they're facing.
And understand them. How many times have you gone to a meeting and all of a sudden you're halfway through the finance discussion and you see half the board members zoning out, staring at the ceiling? I do a lot of presentations to audit committees, to full boards. Of course, the audit committees usually are very engaged. You get to the board, you provide all the information that you possibly can, and you get done with your presentation, and the board member raises up their hand and asks the question that you just answered 3 times because you wanted to refocus them and make sure that they fully understood that particular area. That's what you find a lot. So what we found on our board, and we've developed actually a very extensive dashboard reporting with a lot of pictures, a lot of graphs. We go over every single board meeting in our finance committee section, the finances of the organization, and I've seen that glaze over of the eyes, and once we give out the graphs, I get people involved, and they really understand them a lot more, and how does that pictorially really show them what might be happening. And this dashboard that Laurie has given us here today is a very simplistic way to fully understand good, bad, or mediocre. So as she did say, the 65 days in green, that we consider that's a very good thing. And when we're looking in terms of red, very understandable in terms of what we need to change or make better.
I strongly encourage in keeping the measures for each of the areas to just a few, because again the board can get overwhelmed and you really want to focus them on what's important. If you give them every data element that's out there, you're going to lose them as well. So it's really picking out those elements that are most critical for the board so that they can in turn focus.
And the funny thing is the most common metric that the board keeps coming back to is the term cash is king. So we struggle at certain times of the year for cash, depending on how things are flowing because of the way that our programs are operated, and through the many years of mismanagement prior to the point when I got there. Cash is really relied upon, and we do a lot of this year. Last year, like I said before, we do a full projection of that cash on a going forward basis, and when things don't jive, we ask a lot of questions. And one little statistic was we required our CFO to add into our cash flow projection, not just the projection every month, but the bank balance underneath it. And a number of the months that we had gone through the projection, the bank balance was lower than the projection amount that we had, and it was supposed to be actual, and we were scratching our heads. And to this point, yes, we have a few $1,000s of a deviation between the bank and the projected amount, which we're comfortable with. But at one point, we had a $100,000 difference. We went back, investigated. We saw there was something that was left out. So this type of a oversight, this type of review really does help management move that forward and understand what those little details are and how can it affect their ongoing operations.
The board isn't responsible just for finance, they're responsible for the whole operation. So again, here's a couple other examples of way a dashboard could be used. You look at all organizations are getting surveys on a regular basis, and a standard could be set on what are you going to allow for recommendations or what do you find tolerable on recommendations. So again, this follows similar to other components. The organization might decide they want to have so many POM interviews completed within a certain time frame. So again, that could be done. And if you look at work centers, this one you're going to be wanting to decrease the number of people enrolled in the work center overall. So again, it's a quick way for the board to see, are you making progress towards goals that have been set in place. Human resources, a couple evaluation, a couple components that could be done now that you're required to be doing DSPs evaluations on that regular basis is how many are completed on time and how many open positions does the organization have right now. Both of those are very critical elements for an organization if you begin to think about it. And these can easily be created with a strategic discussion with the board on what's important, what needs to be measured. Keep it simple. Keep it something that's relevant to today and something that you have targets for change and improvement. And that's really what I suggest in the dashboard reporting. But it's a way very quickly to get a board engaged so that they clearly understand what you're trying to accomplish.
So, excuse me, Laurie, Allan, we've got a question for you.
Sure.
It's, can some dashboard examples of program data be shared? From Katrina Stan.
Can you give me an example of what you're after?
I'm going to unmute Katrina if you're there. I'm going to unmute you so you can ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Good, Katrina.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. So our board has just asked us to start going to dashboard reporting, and we're struggling with trying to figure out the best way to show the program data. So I was just looking, what's been shared so far has been really helpful. If there were any other examples that we could get copies of after the webinar of dashboard reporting on program statistics.
Katrina, if you want to give me a call, I'd be more than willing to talk that over with you. It's really looking at what's important to the organization to create that venue, because the board's going to want certain things. And employment, I did because of the work center component. We're expected to go in that venue. You may be looking at how many person-centered directed services are in place. It's really trying to figure out what is the core issues you're trying to do and pick those elements out and keep it very, 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 very simple.
Can I give you an example? In the organization that I am the board president, we're a membership organization. We run a lot of programs. We're not funded by the state for the most part. Maybe we have $100,000 to $200,000 worth of government money. But what we really rely upon are those programmatic metrics. And one important thing for us is registrations. So we have, over the past 3 years, I believe now, tracked registration at points in time within the year. So think about it. I run let's say a $3 million early childhood program. Starts in September of each year. So what are my sign-ups by November of the year before? What are my sign-ups by January? What are my sign-ups by March? And how do I know where the program is going to be moving to? The big problem with an early childhood program, very simply, is the mix of children. So do I have less than a year? Do I have the 1 to 2 year olds, the 3 to 4 year olds, etc.? What type of staffing do I need with regard to that? The early childhood program a number of years ago fell by the wayside. We lost quite a number of student FTEs, really impacted the organization. So that metric alone is extremely important to ensure that by a certain date we do have the registrations, we do know what those mix of individuals are, and then other things with regard to how the program is actually operating. So for instance, we do look at profitability in certain programs. We look at, as Laurie was saying, outcomes. We have actually in our area 2 what we term naturally occurring retirement communities. We are required to provide certain information on the provision of services to the seniors that we have. So what is the best statistic with regard to something like that? Every organization will be a little bit unique. Those who are in the OPWD world will have a lot of similarities, which we can help you with. We'll get some examples out, but as Laurie said, just give her a call, and we can help you hash out a few specifics for your organization.
Can I just quickly ask? Our board has asked that the dashboard that we present be a single page. Is that pretty typical of dashboard reporting, that you're doing it on a single page?
It's optimum. Again, don't make the font so small you can't see it. I really would strongly work with the board to help hone what is absolutely critical for them, because again, I go back to less and most relevant is more critical than having a lot of information, because it takes a lot of time to gather information, so I'm also conscious of how much time it takes to prepare and present this information, because the board wants to see action, and if you're spending all of your time gathering reporting materials, it's not going to get you to that action point. So it's really negotiating the most relevant elements that the board and you concur with that would work optimally.
And what is driving the operations? What is driving profitability or losses within certain of those programs? Yes, a lot of it always does come back to fiscal, but that's the statistics that we do think about, whether in regard to enrollment, usage data, and so on. Yes, I do agree with Laurie that the one page is optimal. I actually have a multiple page dashboard only because we went a little wild and we wanted to make sure we had all the information that we needed.
You know, if I was Allan's exec, I'd say, here's the cost of doing this. Do you really want to continue? And here much, yeah, do what you begin with, and then I negotiate.
The answer to that is very simple. We don't present the dashboard at every board meeting because it was too difficult for our staff to pull together.
Right.
So that goes to the point of what Laurie was saying before.
It's negotiations with the board.
Yes.
I mean, it really is, because you want to give them meaningful information that's helpful to them and not breaking the bank on your operational side.